Meine Damen und Herren, herzlich willkommen.
Ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome here tonight at the Heinrich-Böll Foundation on site, but as well to those who are joining us online. We will be talking about the rule of law and checks and balances under attack in Hungary. And we have picked out two cases that might be of interest, not only Hungary, as I said, but as well the US. And with that, I would like to briefly present our guests to you. We have with us tonight Reinhard Bütikofer, who has he is sitting to my far right. He has been a council in Heidelberg. He was president of the party Bündnis 90, the Greens, from 2009 to 2024, a member of the European Parliament, and from 2012 to 2019, he was the president, the chairman of the European Greens. And in his long-standing career, he has always shown a big interest in the US and China. There are many other things one could say about him, but I would leave it as that. Jan-Werner Müller, sitting right next to me since 2005, a political scientist at Princeton University. Before that, he has taught at the FU Berlin, at the University College in London, Oxford. He's been a guest professor in different other universities, renowned universities, in Budapest University of Renowned Studies, New York University, Florence, and Paris. And I hope I did not leave out any of the very important locations. He's author of many important books. What might be known in Germany is What is Populism? Published in 2016, and I think the last one is Freedom, Equality, and Uncertainty, How Democracy Rules is the short name for it. He repeatedly writes articles for newspapers and magazines, as least as I have known him. Kim Lane Scheppele, teaching at the Princeton University since 2005, but in sociology and international relations, and she has been the head of law and policy at the University of Pennsylvania Law School in Michigan. Then in the 90s, she used to work in Hungary for quite some time, where she followed the Constitutional Court and counseling the court, and then working for the Verfassungsprüfung. Ms. Scheppele has written several articles and books, and she might be known to her regular contributions to the constitutional blog, the Verfassungsblog. Mr. Müller and Ms. Scheppele are here in Berlin in the framework of a cooperation with lawyers and political scientists at the Humboldt University, and both in research groups convene under the framework Constitution Under Stress. This is a format organized for several years. Thank you so much to Professor Kaiser, who is joining us online. She just I was told, and the Professor von Steinsdorf. A warm welcome to the students and postdoctoral students who are joining or are here at the foundation. Petra Torbritz, last but not least, is journalist and author. She has promoted in communication studies. She has worked for TV and print media for the German Wochenpost. Then she has been a scientific director for different outlets, universities, counseling different associations like Food Watch and climate change. Petra Torbritz has received several awards for her work, and in the middle, she is among us because she has lived in Hungary for quite some time and has followed closely the different social movements, and has written a book on her personal experience. It was just released and published in March. We Will Conquer Europe, Hungary, Viktor Orban, and the undermined democracy. Thanks to all of you for coming. Thank you to our panelists and for your time.
Wir wollen über Gewaltenteilung.
We will be talking about checks and balances and the rule of law. And I would like to raise the question about democracy, because this is what we talk about in our public sphere. So in order to make sure we don't lose the right thread, what is important when we consider the rule of law and checks and balances? In order to not stay at the meta level, I thought that Ms. Torberts could start out reporting back on what she has covered for her book, what she experienced in Hungary in the last years, where one could have the feeling that there are several violations of the rule of law to be observed.
Teilweise auch Niedergang.
We might have restraint the restriction when it comes to the rule of law and checks and balances. Ms. Torberts, please. Thank you so much. Yes, to start out, I have to admit that I am a huge fan of Hungary. It is a great country. I was traveling to Hungary for the first time in the 80s because I accompanied TV productions between the ORF and the Hungarian TV. This is where I got to know my husband, and we were both children of the Cold War. And when we fell in love, he had to become employed by the so-called luxury hotel that was supervised by the secret services. And whenever you did a lot of coins, then you were able to call your loved one on the other side. And this explains the passion, the euphoria that so it was when the wall came down and we were able to apply for a visa. I have lived through the end of socialism, when the wall came down, the first elections to be held, and the first success of Viktor Orban when he was not prime minister yet. And then sometime later, I had the idea to collect all these memories. So we have celebrated huge parties in the Posta with a lot of passion, how the Hungarians know how to do that. 3 days of intense celebrating and eating and drinking. Germans, the Swiss, and the Americans always told us to organize a party or celebration, and nobody asks about coming to Hungary once again because the reputation or the image one has of Hungary has totally changed. So what has happened? When Viktor Orban for the first time achieved his two-third majority and rose to power in 2010, he then immediately changed the constitution. And the second element that I think is of paramount importance and has not lost of its actuality, he has created a new media law. With that, created the foundation for the indoctrination of the civil society. The media law was only criticized quite weekly. There were debates in the German parliament, but not only because we're here at the Heinrich-Böll Foundation, but one has to honestly admit that the Green Party were the only ones to openly criticize what happened there. This is a violation of the fundamental rights. What did he create with the Media Act? Well, the bookkeeper of the Fidesz Partei, they have bought a series of different media outlets, and the international owners of a media outlet were basically pushed out of the countries. The subsidiary of the telecom company has organized a very popular news page, Origo, that had to be sold because of the pressure of the government, because otherwise they would have lost their broadcasting frequency. So step by step, this was demounted. Why am I so interested in the media? Not only because I am a journalist myself, but because it is a very politicized issue. Then we saw a phase where the first oligarch of Orban was fell out of favor, and a foundation was created where from one day of the other, a few media declared to being part of that foundation. This foundation was then declared of national interest of Hungary. There was no regulation. We did not have any monitoring of that association. So this was basically a state-owned company without having to be publicized. And this is what Ms. Scheppele usually describes. We do not have a situation where a dictator imposes state law, but it is quite a soft revolution that progresses step by step. And Orban now owns 80% or maybe 85% of the media, and 15% of the media are still independent. And for that, Viktor Orban just presented a new draft bill in the parliament. It has not been endorsed yet, but it says that each and every organization receiving money from abroad, that these organizations have to apply for approval, and they have to pay high fines whenever they do not publish that information, and whenever they do receive third-party funding from abroad, then they are violating the sovereignty of Hungary. And this is defined in a way that you support the promoting of Ukraine from the EU, then one could interpret it as being treason against the sovereignty of Hungary, and could basically impose a fine. As I told you, this is still a draft bill. It has not been endorsed yet, because within the government party, it has caused some strong tensions. There's a lot of resistance within that party, and I imagine that the oligarchs weren't really interested in being monitored, or their funds being monitored so closely, so it has been postponed to autumn. But it's a very important part to know that Orban seems to be accelerating his endeavors and is moving towards the path of dictatorship, because it does not have that much leeway. And I think I might stop here, because when it comes to the rule of law, this was, of course, the next thing that our judges had to leave office before their term terminated. So Ms. Scheppele can say more about that, possibly. They want to take over and step in there when it comes to the judges.
Yeah, happy to do so. And sorry to switch to English. I don't know if everyone's got their headsets for translation. But yes, what you describe is exactly what happened. Let me just deepen that description a little bit, because when Orban came to power in 2010, he took advantage of a feature of the Hungarian system that was completely legal, but really unwise, which was he won in that election 53% of the popular vote in a system where many of the other political parties had collapsed. And his main opponent, the Socialist Party, had just run the country into bankruptcy, and Hungary was under an austerity program instituted by the IMF. So it was clear the socialists were not going to win. I remember in 2010 thinking I was just relieved that the neo-Nazi party didn't win, that they didn't get more support. But there wasn't much choice in that election. And when Orban got 53% of the vote, because of the operation of the Hungarian electoral system, he wound up with 68% of the seats in the parliament in a system where a single two-thirds vote of the unicameral parliament could change anything in the constitution. And that's really the origin of Orban's dictatorship, because everything that followed was absolutely legal and absolutely unconstitutional if you take the Constitution to be a set of principles that really guarantee the rule of law and democracy. So Orban, in his first year, amended the Constitution 12 times, changing 60 different provisions to set up what happened next, which was installing a whole new constitution. Under the new constitution, suddenly there were thousands of pages of new laws. He literally rewrote the whole legal system. And while this was happening, many people on the outside, actually even many people on the inside, didn't fully understand what kind of revolution this was because it was all legal, right? He wins an election honestly. He changes the law legally. And isn't that supposed to be how democracies work? You know, instead, what I thought we were seeing is something that is a new kind of thing that happens now when societies move from democracy to autocracy, which is that leaders are elected, often the first time in free and fair elections, and then they change the law, right? And so they have this immediate kind of democratic legitimacy, or so they claim, because nothing is done irregularly. I remember talking to people in those early days at the European Commission and saying, wait a second, you know, this is really this is becoming a constitutional dictatorship almost overnight. And frankly, the Commission at that time understood that, but they didn't know what they could do, right? Because it was an election, because it was legal, because when Orban changed many laws, he made a very special point of staying out of EU jurisdiction in those early days. And so the Commission stood there watching this, not really understanding what they could do. And there was another little feature, which just to tell you how clever this was, I remember trying to get the US government to say something about this. And at the State Department, I would give them all these documents and whatever, and they would say, well, you know, our embassy is not telling us all of this. You know, we don't believe you. Like, who the hell are you, right? And I would say, well, I used to work at the Hungarian Constitutional Court. This is, you know, Hungarian constitutional law is a weird specialty of mine, so I could see what's happening. And the State Department didn't believe it. And finally, after banging on their door for about a year, they let me in, and I gave them all this documentation. Anyway, there's a long version of this story, but the short version is that the Orban people had infiltrated many of the embassies in Budapest and were systematically feeding the embassies inaccurate information. So this was really a very clever and very legal kind of takeover. And by the time the rest of the world figured out what was happening, Hungary was already a dictatorship. I think by 2013, it was all over. You know, by that time, they'd captured the Constitutional Court. They'd rewritten all the laws. They had captured the key independent institutions, everything from the Public Prosecutor's Office to the Election Commission to the State Audit Office to all the ministries. As you mentioned, the media was absolutely crucial in all of that. They were already defunding the universities to try to eliminate resistance and from that quarter. And just across the board, they had captured all the key institutions in 3 years. Okay, so this became a kind of model for how it is that you can take over what was not a perfect democracy, but, you know, what is. And Hungary, you know, was what had been the kind of star performer, as you said. It was where everybody wanted to go to see what happened when the system changed. It was the star performer. It had a well-functioning economy. It was better off than most of its neighbors. And now we've now had 15 years of Orban, and Hungary has fallen behind economically. It is a dictatorship which is fallen farther and faster than any other democracy in the world. The media is locked down. Politics is locked down. And now what I want you all to pay attention to is that the EU actually finally figured out how to act. It took them forever. The Court of Justice had its hair on fire trying to get the Commission to act. But finally, in December of 2022, the Commission found a legal way to cut most of Hungary's money. And Orban's government is not really ideologically based. It's a kleptocracy. They're just stealing whatever's not nailed down and some things that are nailed down. And going to the money was always going to be the crucial thing. So they cut off the money in December 2022. Fast forward to now, and there's a challenger on the horizon. Might not be my most preferred challenger, but there's a challenger who's reliably running 10 points ahead in the opinion polls with an election next year. And this is where I hope you'll all pay attention, because what Orban's already doing is what he does before every election, which is that he changes the election law to whatever opposition is coming, he tries to anticipate it, and he changes the law so that they can't win. This is going to be much harder because this new opposition figure, his name is Peter Magyar, actually has quite substantial social support, and people are starting to turn out in the streets for demonstrations. There's much more political activism, much more political criticism of Orban, and he's really under threat because he doesn't have the money, and now he doesn't have the political support, and now everyone can see that he's not the consensus builder of democracy that everyone thought. So watch the space, because next year is going to be really interesting. And I'm hoping that, one thing Germany can do is strengthen the spine of the EU to keep the money cut off until we can get through an election, which will not be free and fair. But who knows, maybe Orban can still be removed. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Now, before we get back to the point how to restore things, perhaps let's first take a closer look what makes these developments, these movements, and these individuals so popular. What makes them succeed, at least temporarily? We don't know what's going to happen, but at least for some years they are successful. And perhaps, Herr Müller, Herr Müller, können Sie...
Maybe, Mr. Müller, I'm sorry that I'm going to switch again to German now. So maybe, Mr. Müller, you can give us some input here. What makes these movements or these personalities like Orban or political groupings so successful, at least temporarily? So populism, nationalism, what kind of aspects do we see here that are particularly efficient? Well, for a certain period of time, this was quite a popular narrative in Western Europe that we should not be fully surprised that in Hungary, Poland, and also other countries, these figures come to power because it was said more or less openly that these countries did not have that much time to get used to democracies, liberal democracy, and Eastern Europe might not be that liberal, etc., etc. And there was a variation of it, which was a little bit more self-critical, which said, well, we have made many mistakes. Also, the EU, this was such a top-down mechanism. It was, imposed on the people. It just all sounds very plausible, but from an empirical point of view, this cannot be proven. So when you look at surveys or opinion polls, this is simply not true that Poland, Hungary, before the decisive election of 2010 or 2015, had or were fundamentally illiberal. And we can see it today, but this means after 15 years of propaganda, of Orban propaganda in Hungary, as we've just heard, where the whole media landscape has been fully aligned. As very often in history, it's simply a coincidence, as Ms. Scheppele has said, 2010, this one big party was discredited, and in 2015 in Poland, Donald Tusk was not discredited, but there was the feeling that they have been in power for such a long time now, we need something new. So these are all reasons that every democracy theoretic can subscribe to, so that the population says, well, now we need something else. And in more specific terms, in Poland, for example, 2015, there was already the suspicion that the Peace Party, if it would get to power once again, that, things might happen to the rule of law. And Kaczynski, the main person in power, always said, don't be afraid, we will not touch the rule of law. So as conspirational as it might sound, people were deceived. And when it was done in both countries, especially in Poland, where there was no majority in order to change the constitution, they just went ahead with a lot of brutality, and they merely created facts. So also in terms of what the EU can do, they merely created facts. And they also deceived the EU for many years, also in creative ways, by saying, well, you cannot criticize that we did something. For example, we also see it in Denmark. This cannot be wrong. And before Brussels eventually understood what is happening there, many years had passed. The judges were there in that position. And now we see how difficult it is in Poland, for example, to turn back things without being, in the situation that now we actually push out people from their offices. So, of course, in hindsight, you're always wiser. But the narrative at the time, well, they were the culprits, or we did something wrong. I mean, in a pervert way, even though it sounds self-critical, it's a too simple description of the situation. Well, maybe we can now take a bigger leap across the Atlantic and take a look at what has happened over the past month in the United States and what we might have to expect. Ms. Scheppele, do you want to make the attempt to describe it? I know that in the short period of time it's almost impossible, but you are well trained in that.
Yeah, well, thank you. So I used to think that my knowledge of Hungary was irrelevant to anywhere else, and now we have this in the United States. And actually, the connections are more than superficial. Viktor Orban really does want this model to be exported. And Viktor Orban has an English language think tank called the Danube Institute, which was actually involved in writing with the American Heritage Foundation something called Project 2025, which was the blueprint for Trump's second term. So literally, the Hungarians were in there designing the Trump agenda. And what's happened since Election Day, I mean, it's only been 6 months, but it feels like an eternity because everything has, I mean, the fundamental security of American life has really changed. Some of these things are extremely familiar from what happened in Hungary. So just two things that you can see that Project 2025 and Orban's influence brought to the United States. So one thing Orban did from the very beginning was to look at the national budget and to ask, what part of the national budget is funding my enemies? And then just to cut them off, overnight with no warning, so that suddenly, I mean, this happened in the media. One of the reasons why so many of the media went bankrupt in those early years was that they were highly dependent on state advertising. And Orban just overnight cut the funds, cut universities by 40% in his first couple of years in office, cut support to civil society. It turns out all those vibrant civil society groups were getting state funding. And so Orban just weaponized the national budget, and this is what Trump has done. Trump sends out an order just canceling, as of tomorrow, you get no more federal funds, never mind if you've done the work, on research grants, in arts communities, in civil sector positions, across the board. Trump also defunded his potential enemies. And that demobilizes society. Everybody suddenly doesn't have the money, everyone's scrambling. This also happened in the United States. The other thing that was similar between Trump and Orban was that Orban came to power with this IMF austerity program. He suspended the civil service law in order to be able to fire huge numbers of civil servants, particularly at public broadcasting. This has also happened in the United States. Trump has just decided they're going to fire or put on administrative leave huge numbers of civil servants. It's really hard to know quite how many, but there were something like 150,000 fired in the first month, and across especially fields of expertise. So again, if you're a civil servant and you see that there are these mass firings going on, what do you do? So a lot of people quit. They actually sent out a notice to the entire federal workforce saying, we would like you to quit, so quit now. So there was these kinds of things were direct copies of what Orban did at the very beginning. But what's happened since then now is a mashup, it's a combination of Project 2025, which was a very detailed legal plan to gradually change the law in a legal fashion, as Orban did. There's that agenda, which is moving forward. Then there's the Donald Trump effect, which is that he's not very patient and he's not very process-oriented. So there have been almost 200 executive orders, many of which violate acts of Congress or the Constitution itself. And his whole new staff is enforcing the law as Trump announced it yesterday, much of which is just flatly illegal, which is why so many of the lower courts are stopping what he's doing. I mean, he lost there was one count in May where he lost 96% of the cases that came before the lower courts, okay? So there is this kind of pushback as he's just doing flatly illegal things. I mentioned when Orban did things, it was all legal. That's how it kind of flew under the radar. It seemed less chaotic. This seems totally chaotic because people don't know what law to follow. The law Trump signed yesterday or the law that we thought was law as of 2 weeks ago. And this kind of is now being played out in the courts. And then I think the other thing to say is that the U.S. is very different from Hungary now in the following sense. Orban, whatever you might say about the content of what he did, you could look up the laws and figure it out. It was all done in a legal fashion. In the U.S. now, there's really just chaos. We don't know. They're now, and you've probably seen the reports here, especially with regard to the enforcement of immigration law, and who knows what U.S. immigration law is now. There are literally men dressed in black or dressed like construction workers with no uniforms, no insignia to say where they're coming from, no legal warrants to arrest people, and they're wearing masks. And they just kidnap people off the streets. And the next thing you know, those people have been put in a prison in El Salvador. Last night, the U.S. Supreme Court gave permission to have these at least 6, it might be more than 6, but 6 people sent to South Sudan with no hearing about whether they actually were in legal status in the U.S. or not before they were suddenly deported. I mean, so there's this kind of fear that has gripped every community that is precarious, who have often legal visas. There have been a few U.S. citizens caught up in this mix, people with permanent residence, green cards. So there's a kind of reign of terror that's going on in the United States. It's not affecting everyone, but on university campuses, our students, our international students are terrified. People who were planning to come to the U.S. to be students or visiting scholars are terrified. I had dinner last night with one German scholar whose Fulbright fellowship was just canceled. So things are just happening in a completely arbitrary fashion on top of this legal structure that was kind of borrowed from Orban. So this feels very different than Hungary felt in, those early years of Orban, because this is this legal machine that's operating to change the law as we knew it, combined with this cruelty and chaos that is this overlay. And frankly, I must say, when I got to Europe, I felt so relieved to just be out of the jurisdiction. And so thank you for being Europe.
You're welcome, very welcome. Herr Müller, wie ist jetzt Ihr Eindruck?
Mr. Müller, could you briefly lay out what your perception is? You're working at the Princeton University yourself. What is your perception as somebody who grew up in Germany and as commuting back and forth over the Atlantic? So what does it do to the U.S. society or with the biotope of the American universities? And I know that Kingston and Princeton and his president have become quite active. So to what extent does this change anything, this offensive, so to say? So when we speak about the culture of the U.S. universities or in the civil society, so what changes do you observe? Maybe just 3 elements. I think it would be worthwhile to underline what makes the situation so extraordinary. In the previous examples, talking about autocrats that have shifted agendas in their countries, it still remained important to convince actors from abroad that everything is going all right. Putin still wanted to be depicted as a democrat. And this factor that we see in the U.S. is totally absent, something like international opinion or international organizations are fully irrelevant. So all the work that Orban had to invest in order to convince or to deceive the European Union is not necessary here. At the same time, you don't have those obvious limits. And Ms. Scheppele already said that you could partly compare it as how Trump made business. You do something that you perfectly know is fully illegal, but with the position of, let's see what happens. Do they take it to the court? Do we find a compromise? We just push this forward and let's see what happens. So it's very hard to anticipate because you never know where those red lines are. And this applies to the universities alike. And I don't want to be sitting here to tell you that people are now panicking and people would be harshly afraid, but without comparing too much. But you might recall the book from Ernst Fraenkel, The Double State, from the 30s, where he said everything was going quite normally. So in everyday life, you would not have that feeling that chaos broke out. But it is simply about perceiving something has changed. So there is an open change. It is not fully wrong diagnosing what is happening in the USA. And lastly, if I may, Adam Shevonsky is one of our colleagues, one of the most famous political scientists of comparison policies. And he said the problem is that the US does not have any nationwide technology for resistance. So in other countries, you might find a strong trade union movement, or people take to the streets, or we do something else in order to show our resistance. Think of France or Argentina. This does not necessarily mean that this leads to success, but people have some idea of what they want to do. Well, this does exist in the US. I do not want to trivialize it, but there is no immediate action or gestures. Just think about the general strike in Israel. It did not really bring about any change, but it was a means to become mobilized. And this is a lot more difficult in the US. And on top of that, and with that I would like to close without wanting to blame anyone, that our US citizens have never made any experience of an authoritarian regime. It might be more difficult to interpret that, and to say it quite bluntly that they're quite convinced that they're one of the oldest democracies in the world, that this is the best possible constitution that you may find. And by that, it is very difficult to cross that threshold before people say, ooh, something really risky is happening. And the threshold has been surpassed, and a lot is happening, and I don't want to do as if nothing is happening, but those are maybe special features about what is happening in that country. Many thanks. In the beginning of the year, when Trump was re-elected, I was a bit relieved seeing that we have the individual states in the US. And when we look at the last 2 to 3 weeks and the evolution, so maybe this has been an illusion to say that the federal states with their own infrastructure, their own budget, their own economic power. Let's just think about California. If it was independent, it would be the 4th economic power in the world. So they have some independence and resilience when compared to the central government. What is happening there, Reinhard? Would you maybe start out telling us more about your knowledge on the U.S. society, and what do you think the U.S. Americans or the Democrats, are they paralyzed by what is happening? Are there any possibilities to show resistance? How do you experience that? You have your contacts over the Atlantic.
Gelähmt ist.
Well, paralyzed is the right adjective, and I would even like to add
völlig Orientierung.
a full lack of orientation.
Es gibt in der
I mean, in the Democratic Party, from my point of view, there's been the problem for a long time that they are based on a policy model of adding minorities instead of making the more difficult attempt to integrate different milieus, different groups. So I could give you many examples, like 4 weeks after the inauguration, Obama did not have a Latino in the cabinet, and the Latinos were already on the barricades because they didn't like that. And when it came to the inauguration, the pastor did this, who was against gay people, and Obama did. I mean, we had this progressive policy for young people. I mean, I'm not a Democrat. I'm an eco-Democrat, a green Democrat, or
LGBTIQ
Democrat, or trade union Democrat. And if you add up enough minorities, then of course you get a majority. But you no longer work on the development of a guiding idea for the societal project, for the future of society. And I think that this is missing in the Democratic Party at the moment. I mean, when I look at what AOC understands on a Green New Deal, it is simply a collection of some pragmatic and left-wing radical dreams, and under the headline, which might show some potential, but it is not accepted because one does not understand that one can also be for a Green Deal, in favor of a Green Deal, without wanting to do away with capitalism. And Schumer, as minority leader, who not even had the guts to go into a confrontation where it was necessary, where it was actually unavoidable. Well, I do not see any real orientation. And when I look at what is happening in the Democratic Party at the moment, then I'm going to be very cynical now. That's the way I see it. There are individual persons who now try to ramp up or develop their profile for the 2028 elections, and the governor of California is doing exactly that at the moment. So he does not work for a project that might counter Trump as a Democratic Party or as the civil society in the US, but he works on a project to make himself a candidate for the Democratic Party. And this is similar with other people.
So, wie der schöne Satz sagt,
So, as the beautiful saying is, you can't win against something with nothing. And
wenn die Leute den Eindruck
when
haben,
the people have the impression,
ich meine,
well, the
über die muss man ja jetzt nicht
crazy ones, we don't have to talk about them. They would not be sufficient in order to create a majority for Trump. The fact that Trump has a majority means that he also won the people who are not crazy.
bei Obama.
And the same was true for Obama in 2008. So the idea how the economic crisis at the time could be tackled that Obama had were far left of the American mainstream. But Obama had at least a concept, and McCain did not. And this is why Obama won. I mean, you can't win against something with nothing. And I do believe that it's very difficult to have such an arrogant, self-certain, narcissist person in power like Trump, who believes that he has the wind of history in his sails
einen wirksamen Widerstand entgegenzusetzen.
And it's difficult to counter that
Alternative.
without offering an alternative. And this does not only apply to the US, it also applies to Germany. I mean, when all progressive people in Germany think that the more often you say Nazi to the AfD, and the more often you go to a demonstration in favor of a ban of the AfD, then you would have a possibility to counter that. You're deceived. You're mistaken, because you need a policy that's attractive enough to gain the support of the voters. And you have to try to find out where the root causes are. I think they are much deeper than what we've just described. So why has Orban, for example, in 2010 won that big? I mean, you already mentioned it, because the Socialist Party was fully fully bankrupted the country, and he said, well, we're deceiving the population morning, midday and night, and we betray the population, and there was no other alternative for the population than Orban. So this means that the root cause for it also lie in the dysfunctionality of the democratic parties. And why has Orban been re-elected after he did all the things that you talked about? Re-elected several times.
Darüber sollte man auch denken. Und ich finde,
this is what we should think about. I think there are different levels, and I think it should be our approach to find the contradictions in the different levels. I mean, there's this famous sentence from Churchill, which he said in 1939 about the Soviet Union, the policy of the Soviet Union after the Hitler-Stalin Pact, a riddle wrapped in a mystery, inside an enigma. And so a threefold encrypted problem, so to speak. And I think this is the way we can look at the situation in the US and say it's a bureaucratic power grab wrapped in a populist revolt inside a society revolution. And I think that the conflicts between the three levels should be analyzed at first, differentiated, and then we need to address them from based on a democratic alternative, if you want to, get hold of that and counter that. But I do not see this in the United States at the moment. Well, I would like to follow up on that. I mean, earlier we talked about the separation of power and rule of law, which is heavily under pressure. And you now said, or now went to another direction and said, well, we have a policy there which is without any concept on the other side, the democratic side. So would you say that all this talk, they destroy the rule of law, they undermine separation of power, should be done away with, and you should develop an attractive policy which reaches large part of the population and where the output is at the forefront and not that much the things that we already discussed in this group within the rule of law and separation of power? Well, I would say that standing on two legs would be more wise and not hopping on one leg. Of course, we have to address that. But I do believe
Im Neuen Testament gibt es einen Spruch,
that in the New Testament it said, well, people do not live on bread alone, but the words from God or whatever. But I would like to turn it around. The man does not live on theory or principles of the rule of law alone, but what it brings him. So output legitimacy is decisive here, is key. Why did the traffic light coalition fail that big, as no government has failed ever before in Germany? Because most people were convinced that the only thing they can do is quarreling, but they cannot deliver. They do not manage to achieve what they claim to be the key of democracy, which is finding a compromise and finding solutions that comprise as most people as possible. This is why the whole traffic light coalition project was actually, falling apart. And all the political theory and separation of power discussion is not really carrying us that far and is not really helpful if in the political system certain parts of the population feel underrepresented. Of course, we can ask people how many craftspeople and other play a role in the political system. I mean, when it comes to the Greens Party, we put a lot of attention to ethnic diversity and integration there, but when it comes to the social strata, the chance to get a parliamentary mandate as a sociologist student is 50 times as high as when you are a plumber or whatever. So for those people, this hint, well, there is the separation of power, is not that relevant. I mean, there is a nice phrase in the Federalist Papers where James Madison arguments in favor of separation of powers and checks and balances, and he brings up two arguments in favor of it. One is to prevent that the state becomes a dictatorial power, and so ambition controls ambition. And the second argument is that he says the separation of powers also makes sure that not certain groups in society dominate the others. However, if this is the case, that the plutocracy has already undermined democracy, then the betting on separation of powers for those who have already suffered from it is not really helpful for them. And this means that we have to stand on both legs. And this lack of respect that the democratic policy has shown towards certain groups in society is something that we have to acknowledge. Hillary Clinton has spoken of a basket of deplorables. Barack Obama said they cling to their guns and their God. So the New York Times, first of all, talked about the voters in the Appalachians who brought the majority to Trump on the day that he was elected. So the ignorance and lack of respect is something that you cannot set off by saying that rule of law is absolute key. Well, Ms. Torbitz wanted to say something here, and I'm sure Mr. Müller, you can also say something to it. Ms. Torbitz first. Well, when I did my research, the research on my book, I had the impression that the EU works based on the rule of law. However, politics works someplace else. So, for example, you might all know, it has been quoted frequently, the famous Article 7, which says, well, that or it refers to the fundamental values and their violation. And the article has been discussed in 2014 for the first time. In 2018, this has been implemented. And now we have 2025. And in these 7 years, only letters have been exchanged. And now we know that there is no prescribed process for this Article 7 procedure, that there are no time limits, no deadlines. And on the other hand, the Parliament has, according to rule of law and parliamentary criteria, has always written unsettling reports on Hungary, and then it ended up in the Commission and disappeared there. And of course, there are some top issues where something happens. However, the interests of all the countries with their economic ties to Hungary, the automotive industry, this was basically the first thing that the Hungarian opposition told me. Well, the automotive industry from Germany, block it. And there are many hints pointing to that and in that direction. I also talked to an editor of a weekly, Moja Horn, who said, well, he went to car saloon in order to get a Mercedes advertisement in Catchmini, and he said, well, we can do this because we might get into trouble with the Hungarian government. So they did not dare to put a one-page advertisement in an independent media. And finally, I would like to mention when the Hungarian Council presidency ended, you might remember that 4 weeks ahead of that, Orban sat in the European Parliament and Ms. von der Leyen did really talk about the issues. Peter Moja was also there, and he reproached him of his Russia-friendly positions, etc. But 4 weeks later, there was this huge reception where Orban celebrated the end of the Hungarian Council presidency, and he welcomed every head of state like a monarch. And in his speech there, at the end, he said, well, we have to put an end to this legal activism. We are not doing what the court ordered us to do. So the fine that they had to pay because they violated the asylum law. And I call upon all of you to do it likewise. And afterwards, Ms. von der Leyen went to the microphone and said, well, my dear Victor, and she did not touch upon this issue at all. So my argument would be that we act based on rule of law, but politics actually takes place somewhere else. Reinhard, would you like to say something on that?
On the criticism of the EU, because I would frame it somewhat differently. The problem is not necessarily in the lack of consequence of the EU, although you're fully right. The problem is with the member states. It is not possible that the member states treat Orban as he would be one of our peers, and then thinks that the Commission will pull through something for the violation against the rule of law. There is a nice example of Ms. Merkel being a chancellor, and she
fuel efficiency standard,
she did not know about the fact that the efficiency standards on the automotive industry was to be exacerbated. And she called upon the Volkswagen. She said, you have to avoid that, although everything had been negotiated already, like limits for the emissions. And she wanted to bring about a minority to avoid that from happening. And she called upon different member states. Mr. Bruser from Bulgaria, this is known. He says, friend, listen to me. The following 5 investments are not going to be made, although you go along with me voting in the council. Did you have that minority? Yes, but there was no intention whatsoever from whatever capital in a very decisive manner to impose that pressure. But the real power of the EU is not in the Commission, and Article 7 that you have referred to rightly has been constructed under the perception that the overwhelming brilliance and the ability of conviction of the idea of unity makes it impossible that more than one will go down a different road, although it would be, and therefore it would be sufficient that all join forces if one goes wrong. But sometimes it's not just one person taking a different track. And when we talk about the progress project of the EU is not working anymore, this is why the instrument isn't working. But would the member states act with such decisive manner, then Orban could have been convinced to change opinions. And last year, I think it almost happened when they were talking about aids or support to Ukraine. And then he was so annoyed that he went to take coffee in order for them to be able to do their voting procedure. And I think the main problem is not within the Commission. Another problem appeared in the European Parliament, that the Left Party, Social Democrats, the Greens, the Left Party and the Liberals, they try to verbally take down Orban, and then the Christian Democrats would take down the Bulgarian Social Democrats. So can we not use the Christian Democrats to take on Orban, and we take on the crazy people from the left? Both of you want to step in. I don't know who wants to go first. Princeton. The problem in those marvelous panels is that you might have the impression that all those liberal elites go along and consent. But we want to have a bit of a more contrastive culture. And this is why I would not agree on everything that's been said. And you're fully right when you said democracy has to deliver. And we have a historic figure, is Joe Biden, that totally agrees with you. It is not as if they wouldn't have felt it. They said that we now create infrastructure projects. Where has this money gone from 2020 to 2025? So in those democratic-dominated areas, they have established infrastructure for better internet, employment, and they have not done everything right, but this lesson was not new. And if you consider the global context, Biden, back then, when he said the global conflict is between autocracy and democracy, and the Democrats have to make a different offering, because otherwise we will lose what we call the middle class. And I personally think that he has made too many concessions, and it is not the only alternative of democracy. And I think it might be a problem to take the normative framework to the side. But in a fully distorted reality, this has not been brought across accordingly, or it has been done away with before the results became obvious. Secondly, and now I fully disagree. For more than 10 years, we are surrounded by populist entendeurs. So we have people understanding this. And the New York Times goes into a diner in Ohio and says that now we have talked to the real working class, and they say this and mean that. And this is not wrong, of course. You have to be close to what people think and say. It's fully right. But first of all, so people are revalorized that are not the decisive ones, and many of those things are normalized that should not be acceptable in a democracy. And personally, I do not have a problem with telling things deplorable when they are deplorable. Hillary Clinton, in her very famous speech, she used an adjective that was fully undemocratic, but it was not deplorable. You may say that. You can incite conflicts in order to have a bit more of a rough treatment with your competitor. And of course you're free to do that, but the non-democratic word was irredeemable. So it is impossible to save those people. And this is something you shouldn't really say, being a Democrat. And from our experience, we know that it is very difficult to have people fully change their minds. But then, of course, you're allowed to say that what you say is deplorable. It should not be prohibited. Ms. Scheppele.
Yeah, so I first want to say something about the EU and then something about what's happened, I think, to politics in general. So first of all, on the EU, the fact that the EU was very slow to react to what happened with Viktor Orban meant that by the time they realized how serious it was, they had a second government to deal with, namely Poland. And the structure of this Article 7 procedure that we were talking about meant that, first of all, there's no way to throw a member state out, just legally not possible. The most you can do under Article 7 is to remove a country's vote in the council and also get rid of their money, okay? But in order to remove a country's vote, you need the unanimous agreement of all the other states. And as soon as Poland had the election and said they would defend Hungary and Hungary would defend Poland, not possible to use that. So actually what the EU did, I mean, I've been a critic of the Commission all along. You could read my Verfassen's blog post. But they eventually got around to the right idea, which was what they could do was to go after the money. And in a country like Hungary, money is the whole game for Orban. He's only in it for the money. And so eventually they did find a way, and they actually invented new laws, put in new conditionality mechanisms, and did cut most of Hungary's funds. Now, Ms. von der Leyen gave Orban 10 million euros to go to the bathroom at that crucial moment when the vote on Ukraine was held. That was a very expensive bathroom break. And now the parliament is suing her for having given the money back to him without him meeting the conditions. So the Commission's not, I'm not always happy with what the Commission's doing, but going after the money was the right thing. But let me just say something about what that tells us, I think, about politics right now, which is that I don't think we're in a left and right politics space anymore. This is really a space in which the big political fight is between autocracy and democracy. And if that's the case, then we need to think about building different kinds of political coalitions. So one thing I think that's finally happening in Hungary, the opposition in Hungary has tried to unify across left-right divisions. They managed to pull the parties together in the last election, but between Orban's election rigging and the fact that the far-right party could join with left and center parties but couldn't bring their followers with them, you know, we still haven't made the case at election time that first you have to vote for democracy and then you can vote, if you win the democracy battle, back for parties that disagree on left-right issues. And that kind of argument is not really being made effectively anywhere. In the US, this was something that I think the Democratic Party tried in the last election. It didn't poll well to say, we're defending democracy and the other side are going to be dictators, because first of all, Americans, as Jan said, don't have that historical experience. They don't know how bad it is. And also because everybody keeps trying to pull the political debate back to left and right. And I just think that's not the axis. So what I think is finally happening a bit in the US, not organized enough, and the Democratic Party has been a complete failure at this, is that there has to be a coalition of people who believe in democracy. And that's going to include a lot of people who disagree about everything else. You know, I never thought I'd be on the same side as Liz Cheney, or Dick Cheney for that matter, or any of these folks, or any Cheney, right? And so, you know, but here we are in these coalitions in which there are people willing to risk their lives to bring democracy back. And that's the first order of business, and everything else has to wait. And it's very hard to convince democratic publics that, you know, this isn't about the standard issues of politics. So I just think we have to reformulate the debate, and that also has to come to Europe too, because ultimately that's going to be the choice in the next Hungarian election. That was the choice in this last Polish election, and it was fought like a left-right matter, and now we've got the autocrats with blocking vetoes again. So we have to figure out how to make the case at election time. We also have to keep our eye on the ball that a lot of these elections, when the autocrats have been in power for a long time, are rigged. And one of my big fears in the United States right now is that I'm not confident about our ability to go on having free and fair elections. I can go into the detail, but you can see Trump already starting. For example, he now believes he can run for a third term, which you'd think our Constitution bans, but there's loopholes. And also he's got an executive order that will confuse things already for this year in New Jersey. Too big a conversation to have, but they're already working on rigging the elections. And ultimately in Hungary, after that first election, when there was not much choice, The rest of them have all been rigged. Orban has hardly ever had more than 30% support. If you look at the polls, this is also what our colleague Larry Bartels shows in Democracy Erodes from the Top, his wonderful book. These are not populist movements in the sense of being popular. They get a lucky break and then they rig the rules. Different politics, different platforms.
Vielen Dank. Bevor wir in die Runde gehen, möchte ich...
Thank you so much. Before opening the floor, I would... you can already think about possible questions. I would like to ask you one last question. The idea, to take up the idea of the rule of law. I am thinking about Germany and the United States. We have narratives. Let's take the US. According to which Trump has won the elections in 2020. And this is a narrative that I keep on repeating. As if with the presidential elections in 2024, you re-establish a righteous situation. You might reconsider Octavius Gustavian, who has talked about the restitution. And in Germany, there is the story of 2015, whereas allegedly Angela Merkel has opened up the borders, which is absolute nonsense. But this is a story that is told over and over again, even in the German mainstream. The challenge, therefore, simply a question to our panelists. How do we deal with these challenges? Let's say we are thinking about the border controls now in Germany. This is interpreted and disseminated in a way as if with that you reinstall a rightful situation where we have courts to say, no, this is against the law. It is just illegal. And there is a big majority, mono-majority, or a big proportion in the audience saying that our Minister Dobrindt is reinstating something that should be rightfully so. And I think this can be extrapolated to other examples. I could very well imagine that something like that happens in Hungary. So how do we deal with that? I don't know who might want to step in, or is this something that we take home?
As
we've already started to have a difference of opinion, I would like to give you more for opinion differences, because I also think that this is important.
Ich würde als erstes sagen, das ist ein Argument, das ich zuerst bei
First of all, I found this argument at Michael Ignazio in an interview recently, that one should make the attempt, at least for oneself, to distinguish between the haters or inciters and those who lure people or seduce people, like Höcke, Bannon, or whatever the names are, and those who actually really do believe. I mean, while Abraham Lincoln said the people is entitled to a revolution, this is why it's quite okay to go to the Capitol on January the 6th.
Dass es da verschiedene, wie soll ich sagen, Bewusstseins...
But there are different levels of awareness or of consciousness. This is basically the first thing that we should do. And secondly,
ich will das mal am Beispiel dieser
I would like to say that based on the example of the horrible decision of Friedrich Merz to vote together with the AfD in the German Bundestag in this one symbolic debate.
Well, in
the meantime, the Secretary General of the CDU says this has been a mistake, and this cost the CDU approximately 4 percentage points during the election. The fact that they did that. Well, ours went to the left party because we also did something wrong, but I just want to describe the problem. Well, the SPD and we, and also the left party said, and also a large part of the FDP, by the way, said It cannot be that Merz
mit der AfD zusammenzustimmen nutzt.
now uses this opportunity to vote together with the AfD, because this tears down a wall of competition between Democrats and cooperation with anti-Democrats. Exactly at this decisive intersection, categories were mistaken and were changed. I think it's completely right. The retort by the CDU was, okay, but you cannot say that because the CDU cannot vote together with the AfD, we cannot move. And I talked to a representative of my own party who said, well, I would like to negotiate with the CDU. And Merz said 5 points. And she said, no, I'm not going to discuss point number 1. And all 5 points were, well, out of discussion, out of the question. And I mean, you cannot say you want to negotiate with the CDU and then consider all the demands out of the question. I mean, from our point of view and from a democracy theoretical point of view, we wanted to force the CDU to not vote together with the AfD, but we used this scenario to say, okay, we are not going to do anything. So we are not doing what you want, not least 5% of that. And I think in the situation that we're in at the moment, when it comes to the issue of migration, for example, where a large majority in Germany holds the view that we have too much migration, or at least too much non-controlled migration, you can either
intelligenten, demokratisch legitimen
have a democratic, legitimate, and rightly sound path that you choose in order to deal with this sentiment, or you ignore it and say, I don't like that sentiment in the population. Then, of course, these voices, this sentiment is being mobilized by the inciters, the haters, or the rat catchers, or whatever you want to call them.
Beispiel in Polen.
Similar example in Poland. 75% of the Polish citizens say Germany still owes us. But they are not talking about money. They are talking about moral issues. Germany still owes us morally, because Germany says, okay, we've killed so many millions of you, but we let you into the EU, and now this is settled. This is basically the stance of the German politics towards Poland. And now Tusk did not find a way to articulate it, or we did not react in the right way to what he wanted. And then the peace seized this opportunity and said, well, we want reparations. So what the people in Poland think has nothing to do with reparations, with financial compensation. But if there is no legitimate, no good form of addressing this sentiment, then eventually we end up with extremists. And I think at this point, what you've just said is relevant, that Democrats amongst each other need to be able to find compromise. So this needs to be reflected by them, by us, so that this tendency, which is a tendency towards the right, those who are not in line with this tendency. Well, would you also like to say something? Well, it's a fully legitimate objective. I mean, now we talk about rule of law and separation of powers, which is very abstract, but we need concrete narratives and we need to make it palpable for the population. I fully agree to what you say, but if you invite professors, then of course they come up with these kind of terms, and I'm going to do this as well, but very briefly. So the tendency to say, well, separation of power is something negative. It's about limitation, to avoid power concentration, to make sure that the people or the population is not going into the wrong direction. But it's good to remember Arendt and her interpretation of separation of power. She said, you cannot only limit an abuse of power, but you can also create power for certain actors. It's not only negative, it's also positive, first thing. And secondly, there's this speech of the so-called liberal democracy. And
begrifflich gefährlich.
the terminology is quite dangerous here. this means you play the game of the autocrats and say, okay, in Hungary, very bad, rule of law is being limited, but you do not talk about democracy. I mean, it's true that he tries to do away with rule of law, but it's equally true, and this is what we also heard, that basic democratic rights are undermined, that the pluralistic media landscape is done away with, that there are no fair elections. And the tendency, in order to say a word on the EU, is that we have this slightly technocratic ductus, which says we have to repair something, and then there are instruments, there are mechanisms. So the language is quite deceiving, or quite obvious, basically. And they say, okay, democracy as such is still okay, and it remains with the nation states, but now there's the supranational repair troop, Franz Timmermans from Brussels, for example, traveling to Budapest and trying to repair rule of law. This is wrong when it comes to the content. But if you want to break it down to the PR level, it's also not really very effective. It would be much more effective to say, well, it's also about democracy, but there's nothing coming from the outside, but those who want to have a democracy. I mean, when you look at surveys throughout the world, then you realize everyone wants to live in a democracy, but it's not like in the 20th century that people say, well, we do not like that at all. We are officially looking for an alternative that is not democratic. So this is not the case. So I think against this backdrop, it's very important that you do not fall into the trap and always talk about illiberal democracy, because this is wrong in terms of the content, but also when it comes to the political rhetoric, it's fatal. And it's not what you've asked me, but I hope that it was still interesting. Well, thank you very much. Now we will offer you the opportunity to ask questions in the audience or make brief comments. Please, no long speeches, otherwise the microphone will be turned off. So here I do see two hands. Well, thank you very much, Felix Beutler. I'm here and I'm a Green. The right-wingers are striving for hegemony, and they have gone quite far already through the appeal to the people who should despise the elites. And so would you agree that a campaign which bets or relies on hope, like Obama in 28, would no longer work? Or wouldn't the counter thesis not even be correct? When they go low, we need to go lower. I mean, this is quite provocative, I know that. But the question behind that is, I mean, when you know that fear is quite powerful, psychologically very powerful, shouldn't we then try to, use that? I mean, I heard Navalny's threat for Putin was that he made this plutocracy public. And shouldn't we go into the same direction? Because the bitter aspect is, I mean, there's no real progressive idea in defending democracy. This means we want to maintain something. This is rather conservative. And of course, we have to make sure that the conservatives go along with that, because they all fall into the trap one after the other, because they think that they could win against the right-wing extremists in a political way. I mean, I know it's provocative, but the question is, shouldn't we try to make out the weaknesses from the point of view of those who have followed them, and how can we maybe also in a populist way or demagogue way address these things? Or is this something that we should rather consider a taboo? Thank you very much. I think there was also a question here in the middle, maybe the lady in the middle. Well, I'm constantly wondering whether you have chosen so extremely different examples like the United States and Hungary, whether this was deliberate, explicitly or whether you chose these examples for other reasons, because from my point of view, these are examples that are extremely different. Orban, at least at the beginning, or throughout most of the time, tried to say what he's doing, and everything is legal.
Der Trump, der schert und seine ganze Sippe und allem, die schert sich überhaupt.
And Trump is not really caring about whether it is illegal or not, and it's so difficult to oppose him because he's overwhelming people. As soon as they think they can get hold of him at one place, he's doing something else already. And when the judges at the state level, I mean, not the Supreme Court, but at the state level, the federal courts say that this is illegal, he simply says, well, I don't care. So far, the whole country has not yet found a way to counter that legally. And another short remark, it's not true that the US has never fought against an autocracy. McCarthy was really something, and it's not true that, in my point of view, that there's no opposition.
Den Regierungen und die das werden wollen, unheimlich Angst gemacht.
So they instilled fear in people at the time, and John F. Kennedy
Direkt an die Gewerkschaften uns
had a brute Bobby and the Teamsters Union there. I mean, there has always been an opposition, but I mean, there's never been such a big reason for opposition like Trump.
Ja, vielen Dank.
Well, thank you very much. This was very interesting what you said. First question, could you explain to me why we always talk about the US as the oldest democracy?
Einige sind Amerikanisten, andere nicht.
Some are Americanists, others are not, but I do not want to talk about the whole historic background, slave war, endless wars. So why is this narrative still around? Secondly, Josef Vogel has written a wonderful book, Capital and Resentment, and he in particular pointed out or has shown that in all so-called media strategies, the resentment is the term by which you try to win over majorities. But you first of all have to create a sentiment, and this is not a rational argumentation. Secondly and third, I don't ask the third thing. Well, then I would like to open up the round, or should we collect further questions? Okay, we will continue to collect it. I saw Sabine Volkholz and Eva Herzog next to her, and here we also have a hand.
Thank you so much. I would like to take up one of the reflections of Reinhard Bütikofer. I hope I understood it right, because it did not really hit the right answer. I do suppose that we have to grapple with a problem. Democracy, checks and balances are quite formal criteria. The rule of law is of benefit to the people that could be damaged by illegal actions, who is not violated, is not interested if the state is not acting righteously. And democracy is usually as well the protection of minorities against the majorities. And what is happening right now, what we are observing, is when different societal areas have influenced the climate, like the state of workers and peasants in the GDR, and this has then affected the cultural environment in the Federal Republic of Germany, because people used to be very proud of working in the mining industry. And well, that I think the rule of law is not really that important. And we finish off with elite bashing with what we are observing right now. And each and everyone who takes it up, like Trump, although he is not part of that, he wins. So I don't know if you agree or you don't. Take in if you understood it. I have another question to Scheppele.
Could you give us a prognosis about what the lower courts are actually able to do to stop Trump? Because this is actually missing in the picture so far. And so far we are just watching him move fast and break things. And the question is, how far can the courts really stop him? And we don't know yet, right?
Jetzt haben wir hier noch 2 Wortmeldungen gehabt.
We have 2 more requests to speak. Here in the front and there in the back.
Very briefly, I'd like to sort of make a friendly addition to what Professor Müller said about the U.S. not having good instruments for a national resistance. And it's built into the Constitution because the framers were theorized that radical movements would be local. And therefore, the whole construction of the Congress and Senate and so forth was to localize radical movements and only 2-year terms for congressional districts and so forth. So I think your point is very important. I hope you keep bringing that up.
Vielen Dank. Vielleicht eine Frage an Frau Scheppele und Herrn.
Many things. Maybe a question to Ms. Scheppele and Mr. Müller. I have observed that not only in the US but as well in Germany, there seems to be the idea when we refer to democracy, then it's not protecting minorities against the majorities, but majorities have to win, and therefore it is discrediting the courts, saying that they do decide something, but the majority seems to want something else. What is your take on that? Where does it come from? So why did this majority idea gain so much ground? Maybe just one more last round? No, one round here on the panel. Who wants to start out?
Ja, Frau Traubritz, bitte.
Ms. Traubritz, please. You were asking about hope as a principle, and Peter Magyar is doing exactly that. He said, don't be afraid. It is somehow biblical when he says it, and so he is presenting himself like a prophet, like a messiah, and is mingling with the civil society, which is absolutely in contrast with the propaganda machine of Orban. And with relatively easy means, he wants to establish contact to the population. So, and he's saying things that are well known. So, let's say hospitals, you know that you don't have the best possible health coverage, but he went to the hospitals in order to make it more visible.
Das teile ich.
May I just say that I do agree.
Diese Hoffnungsstrategie.
But the strategy of hope, it has to be filled with content.
Präsidentschaftswahlkampf in den USA.
In the presidential campaign in the US, 10 days ahead of the elections, Michelle Obama
in der sie zwei
spoke in Michigan.
Interpretiere als
And she said 2 things that I interpreted as being critical of the campaign of the Democrats.
We must also grasp the opportunity to say yes. Und im Wahlkampf der
And in the electoral campaign of the Democrats, there was one single yes, which was the yes to abortion. There was no other yes. Democrats did not dare
von der Sie zu Recht gesprochen haben, dass sie eine gute war, glaube ich auch, wirklich Offensivwahlkampf zu machen.
to make the electoral campaign with Biden's idea, which you mentioned before. And during her speech, she turned to women and said, you have to convince your husbands to not vote for someone that makes you pay
your husbands and
the burden of it.
your partners are angry, but you have to tell them. Und diese erste Hälfte
And this first portion of the sentence is something that Kamala Harris never said. In a country that 75% say that the country is on the wrong track, Kamala Harris said, if we all join forces in the future, we can achieve so much more. But the feeling that something is fundamentally wrong has not been addressed by her. She tried to belittle it, and she did not fill with content with what you should hope for. But if you can do that in a popular way, as you said, then it could actually work out.
Möchten Sie gleich dazu?
Do you want to step in?
Yes. So let me address a couple of legal questions before getting to the question of democracy. So first on the lower courts, what's happening in the United States now is that, as I mentioned, a lot of Trump's actions and executive orders violate the law. I mean, overtly, and therefore the lower courts are saying this violates the law, including judges that Trump himself appointed, including judges really from across the political spectrum. What happens, though, is that by the time you get to the U.S. Supreme Court, which, by the way, is a court where, Trump got to name 3 of the 9 judges, 2 in irregular procedures, and they added 2 judges that had been part of a longstanding movement to pack the court with supporters, not just to eliminate the right to abortion, but really most of those Republican appointees were put there to expand executive power. And that's really the name of the game. And the lower courts have to follow the law as they find it. The Supreme Court can change it. And that's why I want to say that, so when we get to the Supreme Court, all bets are off about this. And in fact, the bet that we're heading for autocracy is on. And this is where I think, Trump and Orban actually are more similar than they look. In Hungary, Orban, because he had a constitutional majority, could change the constitution legally. And therefore, there was this very legal characteristic of the transition. In the US, the Constitution is practically speaking impossible to amend because you can't get the political majorities to do it. So how do you have a constitutional revolution? You come into power, you break the law, you pack the highest court, and a year from now they will say that many things that Trump is doing are constitutional, maybe not even a year from now, last night's decision, and we will have a new constitution. This is how you do it in the US. In that sense, Orban and Trump are similar. They're aiming at completely restructuring the legal constitutional order. They just have to do it in different ways. So then let me turn to the question of democracy, because one of the things I worry about, and maybe I'm not surprised because this is, after all, a party foundation, we tend to think of democracy as being mostly about campaigns and elections. But I think one of the things we're seeing with the rise of these autocratic leaders is that we also have to think about what democracy is between elections. How are you an effective opposition in the parliament? How do you build coalitions so that you don't just get run over by whatever electoral majority the aspirational autocrat tended to have? How do you not read the results of elections as rejections of what you just said in the last election? In many of these cases, the outcomes of the elections are given as much by the rules of the game as they are by the wills of the voters. And they're given as much by the state of the media environment, as they are by the concrete campaign pledges that different parties are making. So we have to kind of stand back and ask, what are the things we have to guarantee so that elections and campaigns can matter? And many of those preconditions, including in a place like Germany, are not so robust right now. Right? And so that's where we have to think about the problem of disinformation, which is swamping politics everywhere. We have to think about the fact that voters are asking for choices they don't have among the parties that are currently available. right? And they're asking for change, and no matter what they vote for, they get the same, unless they vote for anti-system autocratic parties, right? So there's a bigger problem with the culture of democracy than just campaigns and elections. And I really hope that many parties, and, you know, the Green Party in Germany is one of these really inspirational parties. So, you know, maybe this is the place where it starts.
Ihr Einwand ist natürlich völlig berechtigt, als Sie sagten, natürlich gab es gewisse Institutionen.
Yes, of course there were institutions in the United States. Of course you're right with that. But trade unions are not what they used to be in the 60s. And we've heard so many bad things about the Democrats, so it doesn't really make any difference. And it is quite typical for this party that they did not really show a lot of interest in permanent mobilization. Just remember how Obama, and after 2008, demobilized his own movement. The world maybe would be a different place if that would have gone down differently. And to the very important question, I'm really happy that we were able to cover the next 3 hours with what you asked for. I think what you proposed does not exclude one another. Of course, it is important and it is legitimate that voters say, we want to know what your mission is. And this is a structural problem. If, like Scheppele said, we have many different parties joining forces, then the voters say, yeah, but what is your plan? So in Hungary, this was a huge problem. They said, okay, the coalition is spanning from the far right to socialism, and what does it actually mean for me? So what is your electoral program? Which is a legitimate question. So indeed, you do have to have a narrative, and this does not exclude that you have to fight strongly to say if the other side something that is not true, or if minorities are marginalized, then we are able to say that. The difficult thing is that one could say it is quite surprising how corrupt many of those autocrats are. Kleptocracy was just mentioned. And the bad news is that the counter-argument usually does not work out that well, not only in the US, where corruption is not vivid. We've seen it in Turkey, in Hungary. One hypothesis is that they don't really know about it because the media outlets are in the hands of the oligarchs. I don't think that's true. So in Turkey or in Hungary, I don't imagine people to not knowing about what Erdogan is doing there. The problem is, however, that without saying anything negative about the citizens, that there are mechanisms to say, yeah, it is true, but he's doing it for us somewhat. Or what is quite popular, everyone is doing it. So we relativize. And it's really not that easy to simply bring proof and evidence and then game over for autocrats. If it would be that easy, then they would have been toppled years ago. So we really have to think about what methods and mechanisms could be. Unfortunately, I'm not an expert in electoral campaigns, but we have to see how to plausibilize it, because the counter-arguments are quite easy to anticipate.
May I make a little remark here? When amongst democratic politicians there are, false behavior that is put under the carpet, or misconduct that is brushed under the carpet, then it's difficult to make this a topic with autocrats, because there is the counter-argument, everyone is doing it. And I still remember a CDU interior minister who had to step down because in some place in eastern Germany, some terrorists were shot during a police operation, which was not planned or foreseen. And he considered it a mistake, and this is why he stepped down, Mr. Seiters at the time. And so today, nobody would do that anymore. I mean, we have a former minister who is responsible for a lot of
mindestens zwei ehemalige Minister, die für viel Verschwendung Verantwortung getragen haben.
wasting money. He wasted a lot of taxpayers' money, and they continue to be around in politics. But this is not really an issue. I mean, they are corrupt. They should leave politics. I mean, if the Senator Menendez is tried and sentenced because he got bribes from Egypt and others, then, of course, we cannot bring up the same argument towards Trump. So the question is whether we have some benchmarks for ourselves that we fulfill, and this is only part of the overall debate. Well, we are coming to an end now, but I would like to add one thing, because there was one question regarding something hopeful. So output orientation is one thing, but I would also like to, emphasize participation or responsiveness. So people in Baden-Württemberg have shown us, and the chance or the appeal to the voters, well, this or that is in it for you and you can participate. This is always a very important message, which might not reach everyone, but many. So we could not discuss everything, but a lot, and I'm very grateful for this panel. So thank you very much to you, the audience, who have come here as guests of our event to listen to the panel, and also the people in the stream or later on who watch the recording. I would also like to thank the colleagues from the EU North America Department of the Heinrich-Böll Foundation who have supported us also tonight, and Eva Herzog from the Humboldt University. Thanks for giving us the contact information. I'd also like to thank the technicians and the interpreters for their work, and also my department, and in particular also the panelists here. So thank you very much for being here, for discussing with us, and now we'll have the opportunity outside to snatch something to drink or eat something. And there's the opportunity to buy the book from Ms. Torprietz that we've shown you earlier, and maybe also to get a signature from her. So thank you very much to the Heinrich-Böll Foundation.